Edgehaven was the kind of town where nothing ever really changed. Nestled between rugged cliffs and the restless ocean, it was a place where life moved with the rhythm of the tides, steady, predictable, and unhurried. The locals liked it that way. Tourists came and went with the seasons, bringing a bit of excitement in the summer. But when autumn rolled in, the town settled back into its familiar quietude. That quiet was shattered one October evening when the fog rolled in. Sheriff John Mercer stood on the pier, staring out at the horizon where the ocean met the sky, or at least where it should have met the sky. Tonight, the line between the two was obscured by a dense, rolling fog that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Mercer had lived in Edgehaven all his life, seen his share of foggy mornings and misty evenings, but this was different. There was a weight to it, a thickness that pressed down on the town like a suffocating blanket. The first sign that something was wrong came with the silence. Normally, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was a constant backdrop in Edgehaven, a soothing rhythm that everyone took for granted. But tonight, as the fog crept closer, that sound was swallowed up, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Even the seagulls, usually so vocal at this time of day, were silent. Mercer took a long drag from his cigarette, the orange ember a small, defiant glow in the encroaching darkness. He exhaled slowly, the smoke curling up and disappearing into the mist. There was an unease settling in his gut, a nagging feeling that this fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about the way it moved, the way it seemed to have a life of its own, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Sheriff?" Mercer turned to see Tom Harper, one of the local fishermen, approaching. Tom was a grizzled man in his late 60s, with a face weathered by years at sea. He looked just as unsettled as Mercer felt. "You ever seen fog like this before?" Tom asked, his voice low, almost as if he was afraid the fog might hear him. Mercer shook his head. "No, can't say I have. It's strange." Tom nodded, glancing nervously at the thickening mist. "I was out on the water when it started rolling in. Came out of nowhere, and fast, too. I could barely see the bow of my own boat. Had to turn around before I got lost in it." Mercer didn't respond immediately. He was still watching the fog, now just a few yards from the edge of the pier. It was like watching a living thing, creeping forward inch by inch, consuming everything in its path. He flicked his cigarette into the water and turned to Tom. "Let's head back into town. I've got a bad feeling about this." As the two men made their way down the pier, the fog continued its relentless advance, spilling over the harbor and into the narrow streets of Edgehaven. By the time Mercer and Tom reached the main street, the fog had swallowed the town whole. Visibility was reduced to mere feet, the familiar landmarks of the town now ghostly shapes in the mist. People were starting to notice. Doors opened and heads poked out, faces etched with concern. Mercer could hear the murmurs of confusion and fear spreading through the small crowd that had gathered outside the general store. "What the hell is going on, John?" asked Mary Henderson, the store's owner, her voice tinged with panic. "I don't know, Mary," Mercer replied, trying to keep his own anxiety in check. "But I suggest everyone heads home and stays inside until this passes. No sense wandering around in this mess." As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, Mercer's radio crackled to life. He pulled it from his belt and held it to his ear. "Sheriff, you there? This is dispatch." "I'm here, Emily. What's going on?" "John, we're getting reports that people are missing. Mrs. Talbot, Mr. Finnegan, a few others. No one's seen them since this fog rolled in." Mercer felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, damp air. "Missing? What do you mean, missing?" "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice shaky. "People are saying they just disappeared, went out into the fog and never came back." Mercer's grip tightened on the radio. Disappearances? In Edgehaven? That didn't make sense. Nothing ever happened here. Nothing like this. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice grim. As Mercer made his way through the fog-shrouded streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The fog was too thick, too heavy, and it carried with it an unnatural silence that seemed to swallow every sound. The town, usually so full of life, now felt like a ghost town. Every building and street shrouded in a sinister, oppressive mist. When he reached Mrs. Talbot's house, he found the front door ajar, creaking softly as it swung back and forth in the faint breeze. Inside, the house was empty, not a single sign of struggle or foul play. It was as if she had simply walked out the door and vanished into the fog. Mercer felt a creeping dread settle in his chest. This wasn't just a thick fog or a strange weather pattern. Something was out there in the mist, something that was taking people, leaving no trace behind. As he stepped back out onto the porch, the fog seemed to close in around him, the silence pressing down like a weight. He had the sudden, overwhelming sense that he was being watched. But by what? Or by whom? The fog was hiding something deadly, and it was only just beginning. Mercer knew he needed to act fast. The town was in danger, and he was the only one who could do anything about it. But as he made his way back to the station, the fog seemed to tighten its grip on the town, as if it knew he was planning to fight back. The fog had thickened overnight, turning Edgehaven into a ghostly labyrinth of shadows and half-seen shapes. By morning, the town's familiar landmarks were little more than vague outlines, swallowed whole by the dense mist that pressed against every window and door. The townsfolk, already unnerved by the strange disappearances, stayed indoors, huddled together in tense silence. But fear has a way of gnawing at the mind, of whispering doubts and spurring reckless decisions. It was this fear that drove Danny Lawson out into the fog that evening. His brother, Tim, had been missing for nearly 24 hours, and the uncertainty was eating Danny alive. He couldn't just sit there waiting for news that might never come. He had to do something, had to find Tim and bring him back home. His mother's pleas had fallen on deaf ears. "Danny, please, just wait for the sheriff to organize a search. It's too dangerous out there." But Danny had seen the look in her eyes, the same look of hopelessness that had been spreading through the town like a sickness. He couldn't bear it. He had to go. With a flashlight in hand and his collar pulled up against the damp chill, Danny stepped out into the thick, enveloping fog. The cold was immediate and biting, the kind that settled deep in your bones. The fog clung to his skin like wet cotton, muffling every sound and reducing the world to a narrow tunnel of gray. The beam of his flashlight cut through the mist, but only barely, revealing nothing but the eerie stillness of the deserted street. "Tim," he called, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet. "Tim, can you hear me?" Only silence answered. Danny tried to ignore the way his voice seemed to echo back at him, distorted by the fog. He moved forward cautiously, each step a muffled crunch on the gravel road. The town had never felt so alien, so foreboding. Edgehaven, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a trap, its familiar streets transformed into a maze by the oppressive fog. As he passed by the general store, its windows dark and unwelcoming, Danny's unease grew. The fog made it impossible to gauge distance, but he had lived here his whole life. He knew these streets like the back of his hand. Yet tonight, everything seemed wrong, distorted, as though the fog was playing tricks on him. "Tim!" he shouted again, louder this time, hoping against hope that his brother would answer. But the only reply was a faint rustling noise that seemed to come from just beyond the edge of his flashlight's reach. Danny froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He strained to listen, but the sound was gone. Maybe it was just the wind, he thought, trying to reassure himself. But deep down, he knew it wasn't the wind. The air was too still, the night too quiet. Something else was out there, something moving in the fog. He continued down the street, his steps quicker now, more urgent. Every few yards, he stopped to call out for Tim, but the rustling noise was back, closer this time, and unmistakably deliberate. It wasn't just the occasional whisper of leaves or the creak of a loose shutter. It was the sound of something alive, something that was following him. "Who's there?" Danny demanded, swinging his flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam caught nothing but swirling mist, but the rustling stopped abruptly, as if whatever was out there had frozen in place. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Danny's spine. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to run, but his mind was caught in a paralyzing mix of fear and determination. He had to find Tim. He couldn't leave his brother out here alone. Then, just as he was about to take another step, he saw it. A shadow, barely perceptible in the fog, but unmistakably there. It moved with a fluid grace, almost as if it were part of the mist itself, shifting and undulating with the breeze. Danny's breath caught in his throat as the figure solidified, taking on a vaguely human shape, but with something horribly wrong about it. The creature was tall, unnaturally so, and its body seemed to waver, as though it were made of the same insubstantial fog that surrounded it. Its limbs were long and thin, too long, and its face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless void, a black hole where a head should be. Danny's flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, the creature moved. It was so fast, a blur of shadow and mist, closing the distance between them in an instant. Panic surged through Danny as he stumbled backward, his flashlight dropping to the ground and sputtering out. "Help!" he screamed, his voice raw with terror. But the fog swallowed the sound, deadening it to nothing more than a whisper. The creature was upon him now, its presence overwhelming, the cold of the fog intensifying as it wrapped around him. Danny tried to run, but the fog was thick, clinging to him, slowing him down. The creature's vaporous limbs reached out, and where they touched, Danny felt a searing cold, as if his very life was being drained from him. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision blurred, the world around him dissolving into a nightmare of shadows and mist. He fought with everything he had, struggling to break free, but the creature was relentless. Its grip tightened, and Danny's strength ebbed away, his movements growing sluggish and weak. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the featureless face of the creature, a void that seemed to draw him in, pulling him into the heart of the fog. And then he was gone. The fog closed in around the empty street, erasing all trace of the struggle, all sign that Danny Lawson had ever been there. The town of Edgehaven slept on, oblivious to the danger that now lurked in its streets, the creatures that moved silently through the fog, hunting those foolish enough to venture out. By morning, when the fog lifted just enough to reveal the empty streets, word had spread. Another person was missing, another name added to the growing list. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now erupted into full-blown panic. People barricaded themselves indoors, refusing to venture outside, while the few brave souls who dared to speak of what was happening whispered in hushed tones about the things in the fog. Sheriff Mercer, already stretched thin by the disappearances, was now faced with a new reality, one where the enemy was something unseen, something that defied explanation. The fog had brought something to Edgehaven, something deadly, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed more lives. As the day wore on and the fog thickened once more, the town braced itself for the night ahead. They knew now that the fog was not just an atmospheric oddity. It was a predator, and it was hunting them. And somewhere in the depths of that fog, the creatures waited, patient and silent, ready to strike again. The night was darker than any Edgehaven had ever known, the thick fog swallowing what little light the moon offered, leaving the town in a state of near total blackness. The fog pressed against the windows, a living entity that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. The air inside the church was thick with fear. The small group of survivors huddled together, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light of flickering candles. Sheriff John Mercer stood at the front of the group, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he surveyed the room. He had tried to remain strong, tried to hold this town together as it fell apart, piece by piece, but even he could feel the weight of despair settling in his chest. The disappearances had continued, one after another, until the town was nearly empty. Those who remained were barely holding on, their hope hanging by a thread. But Mercer wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "The lighthouse," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him from the inside. "It's our only chance." The words hung in the air, met with a tense silence. The lighthouse, perched on the cliff's edge at the far end of town, was Edgehaven's oldest structure, its powerful beam a guiding light for ships navigating the treacherous coastline. It had stood for over a century, a beacon of hope and safety, and now it was the town's last hope against the fog and the creatures it hid. Sarah, a schoolteacher who had lost her husband to the fog's clutches, looked up at Mercer, her eyes filled with a desperate determination. "How do we get there? The fog, those things, they're everywhere." Mercer nodded. He knew the risks. The fog creatures, nearly invisible in the mist, had become bolder with each passing hour, pressing against doors and windows, searching for any weakness. But he also knew they had no other choice. The fog wasn't going to lift, and if they stayed where they were, it was only a matter of time before the creatures broke through their defenses. "We'll need light," Ben the fisherman said gruffly. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. "As much as we can get. The creatures don't like it. It's the only thing that keeps them at bay." "We gather everything we have," Mercer agreed. "Flashlights, flares, lanterns, anything that can cut through the fog. We form a tight group and we move together. No one breaks off. No one panics. We stick to the plan, and we make it to the lighthouse. Once we're there, we can power up the beam and send out a distress signal. It's the only way we're going to get help." The plan was simple, but the execution would be anything but. The fog had transformed the familiar streets of Edgehaven into a treacherous maze, and the creatures within it were swift and deadly. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and the group would be lost. But the survivors had no other choice. They couldn't stay in the church forever, and the thought of facing the creatures head-on was less terrifying than waiting to be picked off one by one. As they gathered their supplies, old oil lamps, a box of flares from the hardware store, a handful of flashlights with batteries that might or might not hold out, Mercer felt the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. These people were looking to him to lead them through the darkness, to protect them from the unimaginable horrors that lurked outside. He couldn't let them down. "Is everyone ready?" Mercer asked, his voice quiet but firm. There were nods, a few murmurs of agreement, but the fear was palpable. They were ready, but they were also terrified, and who could blame them? They were about to walk into the heart of the nightmare that had consumed their town. "Stay close," Mercer instructed. "Keep the lights steady, and whatever you do, don't look back. We move forward, and we don't stop until we reach the lighthouse." With a final deep breath, Mercer opened the church doors, the fog immediately pushing its way inside, cold and damp, wrapping around them like a shroud. He stepped out first, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the mist, illuminating the path ahead. The group followed, a tight knot of bodies huddled together, each one holding a light source, their eyes darting nervously into the shadows. The fog clung to them, whispering and rustling with unseen movement, the creatures watching, waiting. Mercer kept his focus on the path ahead, his mind racing with calculations. The lighthouse was only a mile away, but in this fog, it might as well have been 100. Every step felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on them like a physical weight. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the occasional crunch of gravel underfoot. They hadn't gone far when the first attack came. It was quick, almost too quick to react. One of the creatures darted out from the fog, its form barely visible, a dark blur of vapor and shadow. It reached for Sarah, its misty tendrils wrapping around her arm, pulling her toward the fog's depths. She screamed, and the group faltered, panic spreading like wildfire. But Mercer was ready. He swung his flashlight toward the creature, the beam slicing through the mist, and the creature recoiled, hissing in pain as the light hit it. It dissolved back into the fog, its shape dissipating into nothingness. "Keep moving," Mercer shouted, his voice cutting through the fear. "Don't stop, and keep the lights on them." They pressed on, but the creatures were relentless. Another attack, this time from the left, then another from behind. Each time, the creatures were driven back by the light, but each time they came closer, their vaporous bodies reforming almost immediately after being dispersed. The fog was alive with movement, the creature's presence a constant, suffocating threat. The lighthouse finally came into view, its dark silhouette looming through the mist. It was so close, but the creatures were closing in, their attacks becoming more frequent, more coordinated. They were herding the group, pushing them toward a final, inevitable confrontation. Mercer knew they had to make a break for it. "Run!" he commanded. "Run to the lighthouse, now!" The group broke into a sprint, their lights bobbing wildly as they ran through the fog. The creatures surged forward, drawn by the movement, their forms becoming more defined, more solid as they closed in for the kill. Sarah stumbled, and for a heart-stopping moment, Mercer thought she was lost. But Ben was there, hauling her to her feet, dragging her toward the lighthouse door. They crashed inside, slamming the heavy door shut, just as the creatures collided with it, their shrieks muffled by the thick wooden barrier. Inside, the lighthouse was dark, the air heavy with dust and disuse. The generator sat in the corner, a hulking metal beast that hadn't been turned on in years. Ben immediately set to work, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the controls. Outside, the creatures pounded against the door, their vaporous bodies seeping through the cracks, their hissing voices filling the room with an unbearable noise. The survivors backed away, their lights flickering as the generator struggled to come to life. Come on, Ben muttered, his voice tinged with desperation. The generator sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life, the lighthouse's old machinery groaning as it powered up. The beam of the lighthouse cut through the fog, a brilliant, piercing light that swept across the town, dispersing the creatures like shadows at dawn. The survivors watched in awe as the fog retreated, the creatures dissolving into the mist, driven back by the powerful light. For the first time in days, the town of Edgehaven was visible again, the fog lifting just enough to reveal the empty streets, the abandoned houses. But the relief was short-lived. The fog didn't disappear, it lingered just beyond the reach of the light, a dark, seething mass that hovered at the edge of town, waiting. Mercer knew they had bought themselves some time, but the battle was far from over. The fog wasn't gone, and neither were the creatures. They were still out there, still waiting, and the lighthouse's light was the only thing keeping them at bay. "Send the distress signal," Mercer said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We need help, and we need it fast." Sarah moved to the radio, her hands shaking as she sent out the SOS, her voice cracking as she described their situation. The signal crackled through the airwaves, a desperate plea for help from a town that had been forgotten by the outside world. As the group huddled together, the lighthouse beam their only protection, Mercer allowed himself a moment of hope. They had survived the night, and now, with the signal sent, there was a chance, just a chance, that help would come. But even as he tried to convince himself that they were safe, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The fog still lingered, and the creatures within it were patient. They would wait, and they would return. The story of Edgehaven was far from over. The fog was still out there, hovering just offshore, and its deadly inhabitants were still watching, still waiting. And as the lighthouse beam swept over the town, cutting through the darkness, Mercer couldn't help but wonder how long their fragile refuge would hold. Would help arrive in time? Or was this just a temporary reprieve in a battle that would end only when the fog finally consumed everything?